I'd like to just encourage you. I don't know what you're going through right now, but I want to say that it will end well. It always ends well. If you're willing to stay committed, if you're willing to stay faithful to the vision and to that dream that you have, then I can make you one promise. I make this promise with commitment. I make this promise with conviction. That promise is that it will end well. That if you can choose to hold on to faith and let go of fear, to hold on to hope and let go of desperation, to look into the future, to look into that vision you have, and to hold on to that feeling that that vision has already been made real, I can promise you that it all ends well. Now, I know from experience that when you're going through a crisis, when you're going through a difficult moment, when you're going through perhaps an inconvenience that overwhelmed you, that it's often very difficult to find a solution. As a matter of fact, at that moment in time, the pain of the experience could be so overwhelming that it stops you from remembering your dream. And so here is what I would encourage you to try and do. One of the things we need to make life really successful is we must have a combination of what I call keys to success. One of those keys is a philosophy. The second key is to have a positive mental attitude. The third is to have a strategy that can be executed based on a plan. And number 4 is to have what I call daily habits, things that you do daily and consistently that will determine that you achieve that which you seek. So a philosophy is simply a method, a way of thinking. It's a way of identifying opportunities, and it's a way of also avoiding perhaps obstacles. Unfortunately, when you meet yourself, or when you find yourself, should I say, in perhaps a setback, in a difficult moment, at that moment in time, it is not your philosophy that you need, because effectively, a philosophy is really how to think. I found from my experience that most people don't really think during a very, very challenging crisis. You know, your mind is processing too many ideas and possibilities and outcomes, and unfortunately, the central emotion you have at that point where you have a crisis is really not faith, it's fear. The emotion you have is not one that is positive, it's often negative. And so your philosophy, which is really how you think, is the least thing that you look to for guidance or for help. We generally use our philosophy to design the future. When we get into that experience of living in the moment, we don't need a philosophy. And this is where you need 2 other things: a positive mental attitude, an attitude that is really enthused, that is inspired, that is not negative. You need a positive mental attitude because, you see, the way you think, the way you feel, and the actions you take will determine the result you get. And thinking, feeling, and action, in many ways, is influenced by your positive or your negative attitude. So the most important thing you need, if you find yourself in a crisis, is you need a way to stay positive. You need a way to change your focus. Because whatever you focus on, that's what you tend to feel. Whatever you feel will influence your actions. Now, the key thing, therefore, is if your feelings determine your actions and your actions determine your results, in this case, whether you get out of the crisis or whether you remain for longer in the crisis, one of the most important things that we must understand is, okay, what controls our feelings? What controls your feelings right now? If you find yourself in a difficult time in your life, think about it. What is controlling your feelings? The answer is your thoughts. Your thoughts. And let me break down that word thought into perhaps 3 subcategories, because this is very powerful. You might say, I'm not really thinking. But you see, a thought can be a spoken word. A thought can be an internalized speech. We are always talking to ourselves. Self-talk is what you say to yourself, in many cases, internally. So a feeling is an expressed thought. A spoken word is a thought that has been actually given life. The great writer says, and the word became flesh. So a thought and a word are simply the same thing, except in two different realms. One is in the internal realm of the imagination and the mind, and the second is in the realm of the physical world, which is when you've actually let it come from within, and you've spoken it through a sense that you have, which we call sound. You bring it to life in the physical plane. So what controls your feelings are your thoughts. And your thoughts could be spoken words, internalized speech, or just an internal feeling. We teach the power of the mind and how you must use your imagination, how you must use your visualization faculty. That you must first see it, you must first feel it, and then you must say it. So a thought occurs and can be created on three planes. When you're going through a crisis, therefore, what you must understand is, how do you control that thought? You see, a simple way of getting control of your life and your mind when you're in a crisis is to change the way you think. Get control of your thoughts. One of the mistakes we make, I've made the same mistakes, I still make the same mistakes regularly, but I'm teaching myself to find a way to do better and to be better. And that mistake is this. We often believe, though wrongly, that it's possible for us to stop a thought. Well, it's impossible. If you understand how the mind works, when you're in a crisis, if someone says, don't think about your crisis, that's all you're going to think about. And the reason is because the mind and the imagination, when we think in pictures. We always need a picture. That picture determines what is played in the imaginative faculty of our mind. And unfortunately, the more you try to force yourself not to think of a particular thought or experience, the more your mind is drawn to that experience. Because the mind cannot tell the difference between what you vividly imagine and what is real. So when you say to the mind, I'm not going to think about this thought, the mind doesn't understand the word not going to think. All the mind understands is that picture. That picture you put in the screen of its, what I call, screen of its mind. And so one of the things you have to learn how to do is to do what I call thought displacement. How do you get rid of a thought? Well, you use what we call the law of substitution. You displace one thought with another one. You substitute one thought with another thought. And so a simple way of doing this is to simply bring in a new picture, a new feeling, a new idea, a new word that helps your mind move from where it is and move towards where you want it to be. And that is easily achieved if you have an idea about what you want. And this is where we say you must have your goals, your vision, your dreams in pictorial form, in pictures or images, so that when you're going through a crisis, you look at the picture and you say to yourself, I've seen my future. This is the future. This is the future that I want. And I'm going to decide to live in that future. I'm not going to live in this present emotional and physical state of mind, which I don't want. I'm going to live in the future in my mind. I've seen my future and I'm going to decide to live there. Now, one of the greatest things that you have and I have is the imagination. With the imagination, you can pre-play the future. And with the imagination, you can replay the past. But this is what's really, really interesting. You get to choose how you use the imagination. With the imagination, you can maximize an experience. You can minimize an experience. So whatever you're going through now, let's assume it's a crisis. I don't know what it might be. I don't know what it might feel like. But think about this. I want you to just see how the mind works. I want you to contrast what you're going through now with this example. Now, this is not a very good example because I haven't thought about this really carefully and I don't really know what your situation is. I want you to contrast what you're going through with this. Let's say you have a family and you just found out that you've lost perhaps your wife, you've lost a son, you've lost a daughter, or you've lost a parent. All of them simultaneously in a car accident. In principle, what I'm trying to say is that you've lost your family. Now think about that image. On a scale of 0 to 10, what level, what score would you give that experience, that crisis? I'm sure most of you would say, and you probably would say, I would give it a 10. That's a major crisis. That's a really, really significant crisis. If I lose all of my loved ones, if I lose all of my family. Now, with a score of 10 out of 10, I want you to now contrast that score with what you're going through right now. Think about what you're going through right now. I want you to now score yourself based on what you're going through right now. If losing all of your family is perhaps a 10, what would you score what you're going through? Or perhaps, who knows, what you're going through could be significant. You might find out that it's not as important as you've made it out to be. You might decide, well, I'm going to give it a score of maybe a 4 or 5. You've given it a contrast. Now, I can, with conviction, say that before I gave you this analogy, you may have magnified and, expressed the experience at maybe a level of an 8 or perhaps a 7 or maybe even a 9. And by contrasting this with another experience, you've decided that it's not as significant as you probably feared that it was. You've given it a 4 or 3. Now, depending on what you're going through, you might even say, well, I wouldn't even give it a score. It doesn't even deserve to be scored because it's so perhaps trivial and not significant. Now, what have we done here? We've used the mind to shrink an experience down to something less. In the same way, you can maximize an experience. I love kids. Kids have a really, really interesting way of saying, you're making a big deal out of nothing. I don't know if you've ever had a child say something to you, why are you making a big deal out of nothing? Why? Because they have a way of seeing things. A mother is scolding a child for something the child has done, and the child eventually says, I get it, Mom. Stop making a big deal out of it. What has happened here is the mother has magnified that experience much bigger than it should be. Now, in the same way, you and I, with our mind, we have a way of magnifying and resizing our experiences. So one of the things you have to learn to do is using your positive mental attitude is choose the thought, choose the feeling, and choose your actions. Now, in moving from one thought to another, you have to have a very clear picture of a thought that you really want. Here is the reason why. Imagination creates reality. And the creation process depends on the level of intensity, the level of emotion, and the level of frequency that you apply that picture in your mind. This simply means that if you're going through a traumatic experience right now, or crisis, at this present moment, what you might find is that the emotion you have is one that is fearful, one that is negative, anxiety, maybe depressed a little bit, maybe just sad. That is a strong emotion. So whatever picture you're putting in the screen of your mind, if that picture is a picture of unhappiness or bad news or traumatic experiences or maybe things could get worse, because you're combining intensity of emotion with a strong emotion of fear or anxiety, with frequency, meaning your mind is just replaying that experience over and over again, what you find is your imagination takes that as an instruction that that is what you want. But this is powerful. Very simple. So one of the things you must do is get control of your mind in a crisis. The great writer Paul says, be transformed by the renewal of your mind. It's a powerful statement. Don't conform to the world that you find yourself in. Don't conform to the reality that you found yourself in. Don't conform to what people are saying, and don't conform to the results you have. Transform your life by renewing your mind. Now, how do you renew your mind? You go back and you replay in your mind what you want. Now, Paul also said that anything that is pure, anything that is just, anything that is good, anything that is praiseworthy, anything that is excellent, think on those things. Now, this is a very clear instruction that is encouraging you to choose the right thoughts. Choose the good things, because you see, at that point in time when you're going through a crisis, if you can bring in a better thought, a more prosperous thought, a more successful thought, a thought of you happy, joyful, healthy, and well, a thought that you would love to experience at that point in time, if you can intensify that thought, give it sensory vividness, and by that what I mean is connect your emotions and your senses to the sense of sight, touch, smell, taste, sound. Connect emotion to that thought. Connect feeling. Replay that thought. Use it as a means of displacing the old negative thought. What you find is your imagination will take that picture you've given it, which is a new picture, and in the screen of your mind, it will start to create that experience for you. And in a very interesting way, you'll find that in the not too distant future, that thought you were thinking about, the positive one, is externalized in your world. Now, I can't tell you when it will happen. What I can promise you is that it will happen. So let me recap on what I've shared with you so far. I said that you can't use a philosophy in a crisis. You can use an attitude, a positive attitude in a crisis. Yes. The next step is you can then use a strategy in a crisis. A strategy is simply specific action steps, techniques that you can apply to help you achieve a desired outcome. And I've given you some of them so far. Indirectly, I've been sharing some of them with you. But you need a strategy. Every one of us needs a system. Now, if you don't have a system, I would encourage you to think about creating one. What is a system? Well, a system could simply be, whenever I go through a crisis, the first thing I'm going to do is, now I'm going to share some of mine with you, and maybe you can consider what you can take from my experience. When I go through a crisis, I do a number of things. Sometimes I don't do it well. I've got to be honest with you. Sometimes I don't do it well. But you've got to condition yourself. I believe you should actually have this written down so that you follow a very disciplined approach. When you go through a crisis, the first thing you want to do is get hold of your mind. That's number one, which is what I've been trying to explain to you so far. The battle is in your mind. There are two worlds. There is the world that we live in right now, and then there is the world of your mind. I don't see my life and what I go through in life on the television or the news. And another way of saying that is I don't see what they tell me on the TV in my life. So obviously the life that I'm living is very different. Now, I'm not suggesting in any way that the life and the people around that I interact with are in a different world. No, what I'm simply saying is that the whole struggle of life is the struggle of getting hold of your mind and being a master of your mind. So in a crisis, the first thing I try to do is get hold of my mind. What does that mean? Be able to separate fears, opinions, and facts. The mind has a very powerful ability to magnify an expected experience in comparison to an experienced encounter. What does that mean? In your mind, the fear of something happening is much greater than if and when it actually happens. So the first thing you want to do is recognize that a fear perceived is more powerful than a fear experienced. A threat perceived or expected is more powerful than a threat experienced. So the first thing I want to do is get hold of my mind. Because if I don't control my mind, I can't control my world. My mind is my world. You have to learn to stand guard at the gate of your mind. Like a garden, you are the gardener. You have to plant good seeds and take out all the weeds in your garden. Every day, we think between 70 and 80,000 thoughts. Did you know? And according to research and neuroscience, about 75% of those thoughts every day are negative. So if you're going through a crisis, it's very, very, very normal for all of your thoughts at that present time to be negative. What you have to do is learn how to use the power of displacement, bring in a positive thought, and flush out what I call the dirt of your mind. Now, I'm not saying or suggesting that what you fear, what has happened, is trivial, or that what you fear is not worthy of attention. What I'm simply saying is, it hasn't happened. The fear, the threat, the expectation perceived is more powerful than when it really happens. So just get hold of your mind. That's the first thing that I try to do. Now, in doing that, what I try to do is get a piece of paper and put to paper my worst known fears. What am I really afraid of? I write it down. I also put to paper the facts. Then I put down opinions. And so I can separate facts from opinions. And I can separate facts from fear. Now, the next thing that I do is I have to bring in faith into that experience. So my fear would identify what I do not want to happen. My faith will help me understand what I do want to happen. So that's the first thing. Get hold of your mind and put to writing the facts, the fears, and opinions. Secondly, whatever the crisis might be, you have to be realistic. I'm not suggesting that you disregard what you're going through. No, be realistic. Quantify the implication of that crisis, assuming that it actually happened. Let's say, for example, you're about to lose your job, and the fear is you're going to lose your job. To go through every day, every night, to go to bed every day, or depending on your working shift, but to go to bed sleeping with that fear that you're going to lose your job, I think it's just too torturous. I don't think it's right for anyone to go through that. So what to do is simply say, okay, fine. Let me play a scenario here and say, okay, let's assume that I actually lose my job. So put it down, write it down. Say, okay, what happens? Quantify the implications. You want to do that in 3 ways. Number 1, in time. Okay, I lose my job today. What does that mean? Time implication, what does it mean for me? Okay, I have to start looking for a job. It's going to take me a month. It's going to take me 2 months. You have to quantify in time. Number 2, in costs. I lose my job. It means I don't have a salary. What does that really mean? Quantify it. Okay, well, it means that my expenses every month are £100, and my job used to pay me £110. So if I don't have a job and I have no savings, then I'm £100 in deficit. Quantify, what does it mean? Well, it might also mean that you're going to have to find another source of income, and you may not have that income available maybe for 2 months, so you're going to need probably £200 to take you through a 2-month period before you get a new job. Quantify it. Number 3, you've quantified it in time, you've quantified it in cost, now quantify it in terms of reputation. in terms of what we call the non-tangible way, which is, in many cases, one of the things that makes us worry is the feeling of what people would say, or what would people think, or what would my family think, what would my husband think, what would my friends think. Okay, well, put it down. Don't make it seem as though it's not important. It is important. If you're thinking about it, then it is important. Write it down. What is the implication reputation-wise? Do you lose face with your friends? Do you lose face at work? You've been fired. Is it going to be a taint on your, your CV, your profile? Put it down. Now, you've done two things. You've got hold of your mind. You've now identified and written down all of your fears. You've quantified it in time, costs, and reputation. Now, just as you're listening to me now, can you notice something different? That if you were going through a crisis, and probably you're not right now, but you notice that there's a slight change in how you feel. If you're going through a crisis, you notice that because you're now quantifying everything that is going on, and you're getting hold of your mind, that you're feeling, suddenly, the level of panic has reduced. That's the power of having a strategy. The third thing is, don't walk alone. The biggest mistakes I've seen people make is think that they can solve their problems alone. I can tell you from experience. I can tell you from the pain that I've gone through that it's not really worth it. I'll give you a story. So many years ago, I was going through a very difficult moment in time. Difficult journey in my life. I was young, much younger than I am now, and I came on some very hard times, very challenging times, and because of the nature of the kind of person that I am, having left home to pursue my dreams at a younger age, I was alone. I didn't have any support. My family weren't around me at the time. And so for a number of years, trying to be a man and grow up to be a man, chase my dreams and study and graduate, I developed a habit, a negative habit of internalizing my pain. This was not really good. I developed a negative habit of going within, like a cave. Whenever I encountered a difficult moment, I would just go within. I did that partially because I didn't want to be a burden to people. So I just never used to tell people that I was struggling and I was in pain and I needed help. I needed someone to talk to. I didn't want to be a burden. That was my way of looking at things. A very flawed thing to do. I went through a long period of living like that. And I really got to a point where I was almost depressed. I probably would have gone into depression, but I think my nature and my upbringing, coming from very humble beginnings, I've seen a lot worse. So I think to an extent my strength and my resolve was still there. But I know for a fact that if I hadn't found answers quickly, I probably would have gone into depression because I was in a bad place. Anyway, one cold winter evening, I was at home, and I had all these thoughts going through my mind. Remember, I'm going through a crisis here, and I picked up a book to read. I picked up the book not to read because I was looking for insight, or I was looking for wisdom, or information. No, I picked up the book because I was looking for a way to distract my mind. Remember what I was trying to say to you so far? That you have to learn to displace your thoughts. I was going through so many negative thoughts that I said I needed to find a way to distract myself. So I picked up a book and I started to read. As I read the book, I observed something rather strange. I observed that I had tears running down my cheeks, uncontrollably. This was weird. This was very unlike me. Then it dawned on me that I had found answers. answers that I'd been looking for such a long time, for years. So the tears were simply the feeling, the expression of happiness and excitement and joy that I'd really found answers. Almost simultaneously, I had a different feeling. A feeling of sadness, a feeling of unhappiness, a feeling of pain and regret. Now this was strange because you can't have those two emotions almost simultaneously. But I did. Happiness, then moving very quickly into this sorrowful feeling. And then I realized that the reason I felt that way was because it dawned on me that the book that I was reading, I had bought the book so many years before that particular time. And therefore, had I read the book, I probably wouldn't have gone through the experience that I went through. And so the feeling of sadness, the negative feeling, was just simply that realization that my ignorance was a choice and it came with a very high price tag. As a matter of fact, it was that realization that if I had reached out to learn, then maybe my experience could have been different. Now, I share that to make a point. I share that to simply say that there are two ways of learning in life. You can learn from your mistakes, or you can learn from mentors. You can learn from your experiences, or you can learn from other people's experiences. Learning from your mistakes alone is a slow way of learning. It requires investment of time, emotion. It requires sacrifice. It requires detours, because you're doing what we call the trial and error approach. Learning from mentors is a beautiful way to leverage time, because effectively you learn in two ways. You learn through their successes, what they did right. But you also can learn from their failures by reverse engineering and saying, this is what I should not do. So in my case, going back to the story, the sadness was that I realized, oh, had I read this book? The author had so beautifully described their journey and how they overcame. They described finally their success and victories and how they achieved that. But before that, they had described the obstacles and the failures and the setbacks. And so I realized that in this particular book were two success equations: success and re-engineered failure. In other words, what to avoid. And that is what I call learning from OPE, other people's experiences. Leverage comes in many forms. The leverage of other people's money, the leverage of other people's time, other people's wisdom, other people's experiences. So I've given you this long explanation to say this. When you go through a crisis, don't try to walk alone. Find people, the right people. Reach out to somebody, a few people, and say, this is how you're going to do it.